We call our multiliteracies pedagogy learning by design, and the 4 quadrants that you can see here map out the kinds of knowledge outcomes and knowledge goals that each domain requires.
Literacy learning involves 4 kinds of activity type, if you like. So we've replaced the idea of situated practice, or we've reframed that idea as experiential learning, as experiencing. And what we do when we do experiential learning is a couple of things. We can experience the known. In other words, we can get kids to bring in texts from their own lives and analyse those texts. So those texts are things which are familiar to them, which are part of their everyday life worlds, which are part of their interests, their cultures, their identities, all that kind of stuff. But the other thing we can do experientially is we can immerse learners in new kinds of text. We can show them a video, we can get them to read a book, and there might be something about this which is strange and unfamiliar or new, where we're pushing students into new territory. Now, there's a very important theoretical point here about pedagogy, and that is the new can only be new to a certain degree. The Russian theorist of language and thought, Lev Vygotsky, he said that where we learn is in a zone of proximal development. So it can't be too unfamiliar. This zone is stuff which is somewhat related to what we know already, but it's new and not too new. So let me just say this. If we were to operate fully within experiencing the known, we would learn nothing because we already know it, we're immersed in it. So that's a nice segue to bring in the everyday world of students' everyday experience, and actually to bring in learner diversity as well. However, we always need to be pushing out into the new, but never too far. So let's say, look, here's an absurd language exercise. I know no Chinese and I'm put into a 3rd year of a Chinese language course. Well, I'll learn nothing because it's outside of that zone of proximal development. So experiencing the new always has to be within a zone of newness and unfamiliarity, but not too new and not too unfamiliar. So we've reframed the idea of situated practice in these experiential terms.
Situated practice involves experiencing. It's experiencing the known, placing a student in a situation that's very familiar to them, and also placing students in experiences that might be new to them. But in both instances, there is an actual engagement with a domain in an experiential way where the children can actively engage with a particular area, whether it's discovering how a pond operates, or going to a pond and exploring what's there, or looking at electricity and turning on switches, turning them off, actually what they really know, getting to know the language associated with the experiential knowledge of a particular domain.
The second area, or the second quadrant in our diagram, we call conceptualizing. So one of the things we've traditionally done in language learning, and in fact all disciplinary work, to be quite frank, in all subject areas, is we name things. We call these things in language, nouns and verbs. We call things on a website, links and menus, or there's a whole lot of terminology that we use. Now, in everyday practical activity, for example, in everyday speech, we don't have to know what a noun and a verb is. But in learning, it's a kind of a shortcut to explain how language works, or to explain how information architectures or meaning designs work. And what we can do is we can put these names together into theories. So for example, how a website works, if I put down the concepts which describe all the components of a website, I can then build a little theory of how a website works. So if I'm doing website design, I need to have a little theory about how effective websites communicate in order to be a good website designer. And perhaps in order to be a good writer, I need to have a theory of how language works. Now, one example of how language works in theory is I can have a theory of how to write an argument. So if I'm going to write an argument, here's the theory. I have a thesis, and paragraph by paragraph, I back that thesis up with with claims, and I support each claim with evidence. And what I might do is I might actually recognise counterclaims, and I might discuss and even dispute the evidence that people making counterclaims make, and I might make a rebuttal, and then I might reach a conclusion. So that language, so firstly I have names for these components of an argument, which is, claims, evidence, rebuttal, thesis, conclusion. So I have these names, but my theory of argument is how an argument hangs together with these concepts of argumentation. So in other words, these are to be able to think explicitly in this kind of meta language about how language works and how meaning is expressed is pretty important and pretty useful in a learning environment.
It is very important to take the learner into what we call overt instruction, which is to then be able to conceptualize about any particular experience. If you take the pond, for example, how do we name the processes that are happening in the water, or between the water and the air, or with sunshine and plants? How do you name things? What kind of theories are involved in understanding how those processes work? So overt instruction involves conceptualizing and taking any particular area beyond the experience of it in understanding it to the theoretical domain.